Having the Will to Change by Marguerite Howick. Read by Debbie McGee. The solicitor watched Ted shuffle towards the door and out of his office. Bent double and worn down by grief at the recent death of his black Labrador, the poor old man did not look long for this world. Yet when he had phoned a week ago to make this appointment, there had been more than a hint of excitement in his voice. Philip supposed that now the matter was settled in Ted's mind, he was experiencing a sense of anticlimax, not an uncommon occurrence once someone had finally got their affairs in order. And goodness, what an estate Ted had to bestow. A detached 5-bedroom property with outbuildings and a huge field, in a prime location with outline planning permission for 10 more dwellings to be built. That was some inheritance. And up to this morning, it was all going to be left to an animal charity. Ted had loved dogs for all of the 40 years that he had lived in the village, and so no one had been surprised after his wife Edna had died a year ago and they, a childless couple, that he had made that decision. He was well known to all the community, such a kind man, a generous soul. Why, Philip's own twin boys, along with all the other local children, had learned to ride ponies, graduating to horses in Ted's field. How many garden parties, hog roasts and summer fetes had he and Edna hosted over 4 decades? How many baskets of apples from his orchard, punnets of strawberries from the greenhouse and green beans from his vegetable patch had he left on their doorsteps? Look what he had done for the primary school's focus on enterprise in terms of encouraging the pupils to grow their own produce, market it and sell it back to the canteen supervisor. He was a real gem. Philip sighed, silently reprimanding himself for having sat so long in reminiscence, because this would not get his work done and the will rewritten. So pushing his glasses further up his nose, he looked down once again at his notes from the meeting. Contemplating the document changes needed to comply with his client's unequivocal request, he stared at the name of the benefactor, Elaine Fry. When Ted had first arrived all that time ago, there had been rumours of a previous marriage and a daughter up in the north of the country, but there'd never been any sightings of visitors and nothing was ever mentioned, so the gossip had petered out until a few months ago when the estranged daughter had made a sudden reappearance in Ted's life. It had knocked them all for 6, not least Ted himself, but there was one thing of which Philip was absolutely certain, and that was, as soon as he had updated the will, posted it back to Ted, and he had signed it in the presence of 2 witnesses, then, in the not too distant future, once Ted had passed away, that estranged daughter was now going to be one extremely wealthy woman. What Philip could not possibly know was that Elaine Fry hated her natural father with a passion that was bordering on the pathological. She had been 11 years old when he had abandoned them, walked out on her and her mother, never to return, and for that desertion she would never forgive him. Leave her? He had been her world, and she his darling little princess. They had always been inseparable, and he had doted on her and granted her every wish. Never contact her again. Of course, once her own mother had died, and in clearing the house, she had found in the attic, underneath the floorboards, a dust-covered box of unopened birthday cards and Christmas presents, addressed to her from him. She might have revised her opinion. However, Elaine Fry was not a woman to let the truth get in the way of a deep-seated, long-harboured grudge. So instead, she burned them. Her mother had never really recovered from the shock of her husband leaving, and after a string of unsuitable partners, she had finally crumpled, aged and bitter, into an armchair from which she had rarely moved, and in which, earlier this year, she had suffered that fatal heart attack. Neither of them have ever worked, and left on her own with only her benefits package to pay for the rent, her cigarettes and her bar bills, Elaine decided it was high time that she tracked her father down and ensured that he paid for what he had done all that time ago, safeguarding her own future into the bargain. It really had not been that difficult to find him. The wife of his childhood best friend was still alive and living in a local care home. Elaine's guess that he had remained in touch with her had proved correct, and all it had taken was a visit, a box of chocolates, and a few tears shed, and she had the silly old crone believing that the only thing left of any importance in Elaine's life was to find her long-lost father, beg his forbearance at the time that had elapsed, and hopefully make it up with him. She hoped Ted would be just as gullible. The first time she had travelled down south by train, booked into a cheap bed and breakfast place and wandered around the general area without actually going along his lane, that would make her too conspicuous to the locals. And despite being impressed by his rather grand address, a huge improvement on her wildest imaginings, to be fair, she wanted to get her bearings in this tacky little seaside holiday town before making her move. She explored quite freely because they were hardly going to recognise each other, even if they brushed shoulders in a shop. It was all a little lacklustre, in her opinion, with tired-looking, drab residents who rarely smiled. That did not bother her, though, because she was hardly going to hang around and make a life here. No, once she had conned the doddery, senile idiot into believing that she wanted to look after him in his latter months, the rest would just follow. She would eventually sell everything and head for the Mediterranean sun. It would be a right pain while she acted out this role. She was hardly the caring sort, but once she had wheedled her way in and he had altered his will in her favour, it might not take as long as she thought. In fact, if she was careful, she might even be able to speed up the process and assist his departure from this earthly world into the next. Ted, of course, had not been able to believe his good fortune. All these years with not a word. And then, out of the blue, she had knocked on his door. It had been such a difficult decision to walk away from her when she was barely in secondary school. But her mother's affair with a member of the local pub's darts team had proved the last straw. Of course, he would never let his daughter know that was the reason why he had not been able to live with them any longer. But the shame of it still made his skin tingle. Never mind, he had made a happy and contented life down here, and once he had remarried, he had been more than rewarded. But Elaine appearing really was a life changer. It was the cherry on top of the icing on the cake. She had been a real treasure these past months, so devoted in looking after him, doing all the shopping, cooking all his meals, and making every one of his drinks. Nothing was too much trouble for her, and she would not even let him help in the kitchen anymore, bless her. It was such a shame that ever since she had moved in, he had suffered such fatigue, gradually becoming totally exhausted. Everything was such an effort these days. He had to drag himself around in a soporific stupor. She was not seeing him at his best at all, and if anything, he was getting worse every hour. A bit like his poor old dog, usually such an affectionate and lively fellow, but from the moment Elaine arrived, he also had slowly declined until the day he breathed his last. It was all so frustrating. Ted wanted he and his daughter to spend some quality time together because he knew he did not have much time left. What he needed was a holiday to recharge his batteries while she was away for a bit catching up with a friend, and then everything would be perfect. So after he had visited the solicitor's office, and what a brilliant idea that had been of Elaine's for him to change his will, because quite rightly, as she said, she would benefit more from money than a bunch of rescue dogs. He had potted along to the travel agents and booked a few days with a coach company to go along the coast and enjoy a few nights in a nice little hotel. He would return rested, full of energy, and it would make the world of difference to their relationship. So with that in mind, he went straight home to pack. It was the neighbour who discovered his body. She thought he was still on his mini holiday and had let herself in to do the post. But as soon as she opened the door, she knew something was wrong. The big house just didn't feel the same. She called out his name as she stepped over the letters and went from room to room until her worst fears were confirmed. He was lying face down on the bed amid an assortment of clothes laid out beside an opened suitcase. He must have collapsed while packing. She felt dreadful because he had been there for days and he had not deserved that indignity. She hurried back downstairs, as if there was any need to rush now, to phone the emergency services and promised them that she would wait there until they arrived. She was far too shaken to consider going back upstairs, but she realised that she could clear the way in for the paramedics. So she walked back over to the opened front door and, bending over to pick up the post, noticed the very official-looking letter on the top of the pile that lay prominently on the mat. It had special embossed lettering displayed on the envelope. She recognised the name. It was from the local solicitor's office, and it had arrived the day after Ted was supposed to have boarded the coach. She did hope it was not something important.